There is a particular kind of silence that exists underground. It is not the silence of an empty room, or the silence of a library, or even the quiet that settles over a city at 3 in the morning, when the last trains have stopped running and the streets have gone still, and the only sound is the occasional car passing several blocks away, its headlights sweeping across nothing. Underground silence is older than all of those. It carries weight, it has texture. It holds within it the pressed and patient presence of everything that has been placed above it. Every building, every road, every century of human movement and noise and forgetting. And beneath the 8 capitals of Australia, that silence has been deepening for a very long time. Tonight, we're going to move through that silence together. We are going to descend, gently and without haste, into the spaces that exist below the cities you know. Below the glass towers and the
Good
morning
morning,
traffic.
Elizabeth.
Below the
market
coffee
seems
shops and the
quiet
university
today.
buildings and the
Indeed,
wide
John.
colonial
It's a
streets that
lovely
were
day
laid
for a
out by
walk
surveyors
regardless.
who believed they were building
I
something
believe we
entirely
can
new
sell
on
this at
land
the
they
market
did not fully
today.
understand. Beneath all of it, there are rooms that have been sealed. There are passages that have been bricked over and plastered shut and forgotten. There are chambers that were carved by hand into sandstone and limestone and red clay, carved by men whose names we have mostly lost, and there are spaces far older than those chambers. Spaces that were sacred long before the first European ship appeared on the horizon. Spaces that hold within them the compressed record of human presence on the oldest inhabited continent on Earth. Nobody's allowed in. That is the phrase that follows these places like a shadow. Sometimes it is an official restriction, a heritage order or a safety closure, a fence with a padlock and a sign explaining that the ground beyond it is unstable or protected or both, or all three at once. Sometimes it is simply the weight of earth and time that makes entry impossible, because the tunnels have collapsed inward, because the doors have been sealed behind layers of concrete poured by men who assumed nobody would ever need to go back through them, because the water table has risen and filled the lower chambers with dark, still water that reflects nothing and moves only when the ground shifts above it. And sometimes the restriction is more subtle than any of these. Sometimes a place is sealed not by authority or physics, but by the simple accumulation of forgetting. Nobody goes in, because nobody remembers that there is anything to go into. The city has grown over the entrance, and the entrance has become a wall, and the wall has become a building. And the building has become so completely ordinary that the thought of what lies beyond it cannot find purchase in the minds of the people who walk past it every day. We will not be breaking any rules tonight. We will not be going anywhere that is genuinely forbidden or dangerous. What we are going to do is something quieter and stranger and more patient than that. We are going to let the history of these underground places wash over us slowly. The way water moves through limestone, unhurried and without urgency, finding every passage, filling every hollow, carrying nothing louder than a whisper. We are going to listen to the stories that have been pressed into the stone and sediment and brick beneath 8 Australian cities. And we are going to let those stories settle around us like the particular, weighted silence of a place that has been underground for a very long time. Make yourself comfortable. Pull whatever you have around you and let it settle. There is no hurry tonight. There is no particular destination. We are going to move slowly through 8 underground histories, and we are going to dwell in each one for as long as it takes to feel the weight of it, the particular quality of time and darkness that belongs to each of these places. The cities above us will wait. They are good at waiting, and the spaces beneath them have been waiting far longer. We're going to begin in the oldest colonial city on the continent, a city built on sandstone ridges above a harbour, so extraordinary that everyone who sees it for the first time feels they have already been there in a dream. A harbour that glittered and astonished and welcomed ships from the other side of the world for more than 2 centuries. We are going to begin beneath Sydney. Close your eyes if you would like to. Imagine the harbour first. Try to see it before the city was there, before anything was there except the land and the water and the people who had lived beside it for 50,000 years. The harbour in that condition, in the years before the first European ship appeared at its entrance, was simply and completely itself. It was a drowned river valley, carved over millions of years by the slow action of water, working through the Hawkesbury sandstone, the ancient stone that forms the bedrock of the Sydney Basin, and then filled by the rising seas at the end of the last ice age. The water that filled it was salt and clear, and the shoreline it created was among the most intricate in the world. A geometry of coves and inlets and headlands and bays nested inside one another, so elaborately that the harbour seems less like a single body of water than like a whole collection of harbours, each one opening onto the next. The Gadigal people, who were the traditional custodians of the southern shore of the harbour and the land that would become the city of Sydney, had lived in this landscape for a very long time before any Europeans arrived. 50,000 years is the conservative estimate. The actual period of occupation may be longer. The Gadigal knew every inlet of the harbour by a name that was also a description and also a story. They had detailed and accumulated knowledge of the harbour's fish populations, its tidal rhythms, the places where particular plants grew in particular seasons, the location of every freshwater spring and every reliable food source. This knowledge was encoded in their language and their ceremony and their movement through the landscape, and it constituted a form of understanding of that landscape that the European settlers who arrived in January of 1788 would never approach, no matter how many surveys they conducted or how many maps they drew. The first thing the settlers needed, more urgently than anything else, except perhaps a place to sleep, was fresh water. The harbour that surrounded them on three sides was salt. The supply ships that had carried them from England were not going to turn around quickly enough to resupply a colony that was drinking its way through the casks it had brought. Arthur Phillip, the first governor of the colony, sent men to look for fresh water along the harbour shore, and what they found was a small stream that emerged from the sandstone ridges to the north of where the settlement would eventually grow, trickling down through a shallow gully between two ridges of stone toward the harbour's edge. It was not a powerful stream. In the dry months, it slowed to almost nothing. But it ran clean and cold from the sandstone, and it was what there was. And the colony named it the Tank Stream, a name so practical it contains no poetry at all, and they built their lives around it. The Tank Stream was Sydney's first public water supply, and from the very beginning of the settlement, it was treated with a mixture of desperate dependence and casual contempt that would characterise European relationships with the Australian environment for the next 200 years. The water was essential in the most immediate sense. Every person in the colony drank it. Every ship that came into the harbour and needed to take on fresh water drew from it. The governor issued regulations about its protection almost immediately, prohibiting the dumping of waste within a certain distance of the stream, forbidding the washing of clothes in its upper reaches, attempting to maintain the quality of the water on which every life in the settlement depended. These regulations were not well observed. The settlement was chaotic, and the population was largely composed of people who had not chosen to be there and who had other things to worry about than the purity of a small stream. And almost immediately, the Tank Stream began to suffer the consequences of being essential to a settlement that was not yet organized enough to take care of anything. Waste was dumped into it, directly and routinely. Animals were allowed to wade through it, cattle and pigs and goats leaving their contributions in the water that the settlement drank. The gully through which it flowed became first a drain, and then something worse than a drain, a channel for everything the settlement produced that it did not know what else to do with, and the water that had run clean from the sandstone was, within a decade of the settlement's foundation, something that reasonable people tried to avoid. By the early 1800s, the Tank Stream was no longer a stream in any meaningful functional sense. It was an open sewer passing through the middle of a growing town. The colony moved on, as it always did, to the next available resource. Wells were sunk throughout the settlement. The botany swamps to the south were eventually tapped. Dams were built in the mountains to the west as the population grew beyond what local sources could support. And Sydney forgot the Tank Stream the way you forget something that has become too inconvenient and too embarrassing to remember. The forgetting was made literal in the years between roughly 1820 and 1860, as the expanding city paved the gully through which the stream had run. The Stone Valley walls were lined with brick, and then roofed with sandstone slabs, and then covered with fill, and then paved, and the stream disappeared completely beneath the developing city above it. It continued to flow through its tunnel, carrying its diminished and contaminated water through the foundations of buildings that rose above it with no awareness of what was underneath for the next 150 years, for generations of Sydney residents who walked above it without knowing. The tunnel is still there today. It runs beneath the central business district of modern Sydney, beneath some of the most expensive square meters of real estate anywhere on Earth, beneath the glass towers and the underground shopping arcades and the commuter train lines and the basement car parks and the service corridors of the modern city. It is approximately 400 meters long. The walls are sandstone, the original stone of the valley cut and shaped by the iron tools of convict workers in the first decades of the 19th century. In places you can still see the marks those tools left, the regular striations in the stone, the evidence of individual hands working in the specific conditions of that specific moment, the marks of men whose names are in no record that has survived. The water that flows through the Tank Stream today is not drinking water. It is the runoff of the city above, the rain that falls on the streets and the rooftops and finds its way down through the drains and gutters and the cracks between paving stones and the permeable zones in the old fill. And it follows the old channel in the same direction it always has, downhill toward the harbour. When it rains heavily in Sydney, as it does several times a year in the long summer storms, the Tank Stream runs with some urgency, carrying the city's surface water through the tunnel and into the harbour with a quiet efficiency that the tunnel's builders, who had different intentions for it, never imagined. When the weather is dry, the flow reduces to a thin trickle along the lowest courses of the stone floor, and in those conditions, in the dry and steady darkness of the tunnel, you can hear the sound the city makes from underneath. The traffic above is a low, continuous vibration, more felt in the soles of the feet and the skin of the hands than heard with the ears. The trains on the network above are a passing rumble, a brief intensification of the background tremor that builds and peaks and then fades back into the constant low frequency of a city moving. And underneath all of it, threading through the vibration and the rumble, there is the small steady sound of water moving over stone, the same sound the stream made before any of this was here, before the buildings and the roads and the people who built them, the sound of water finding the lowest available path toward the sea. The Tank Stream is the oldest piece of European infrastructure in Australia that is still technically in service. It has been classified as a heritage item. It is protected by law, and it is sealed from public access, accessible through maintenance hatches that require both physical keys and the permission of the relevant authority, opened infrequently and under close supervision, not because there is anything in the tunnel that needs to be hidden, but because the space is not safe for unsupervised entry. The tunnel does not belong to the public who walk above it. It belongs to the city in a different way, in the way that the infrastructure belongs to the city, which is to say it belongs to nobody and everybody simultaneously, present and inaccessible and moving its thin stream of rainwater through the dark. There is something else beneath the older parts of Sydney that has its own sealed history, and it speaks to a different kind of preservation, a different kind of time. The area known as the Rocks, which occupies the sandstone ridge and waterfront on the western side of the harbour, south of the bridge, was the first place in the settlement where people built permanent homes. The convicts and the freed convicts and the sailors who had missed their ships, and the dealers and the publicans and the people who existed in the grey and necessary margins of any new settlement, built their houses here, pushing them into the irregular sandstone landscape, hanging them over the water, cutting rooms directly into the cliff face, creating a neighbourhood that was dense and complicated and alive with the particular energy of a waterfront place where goods and money and information all moved in the same busy channels. The Rocks was, for most of the 19th century, a place the respectable parts of Sydney preferred not to think about too directly. And then, in 1900, the bubonic plague arrived in Sydney Harbour on a ship from South America. And in the following months, as the disease spread through the city, the authorities used the opportunity to do what they had been considering for years. They demolished most of the Rocks. They knocked down the oldest, densest, most irregular parts of the neighbourhood and replaced them with warehouses and eventually with the approaches to the harbour bridge, which was built in the 1920s and 30s. They did not remove the foundations. The sandstone was too hard and the work too expensive, and there were already new things being built on top, and the foundations of the demolished buildings stayed in the ground with their cellars intact, covered over with fill and bitumen. In subsequent decades, archaeologists working in advance of and alongside various construction and heritage projects have been uncovering these buried foundations, layer by layer, centimetre by centimetre. Some of these spaces are now accessible as part of the heritage precinct. Others are sealed again, covered back over because the resources and the plan for their interpretation are not yet in place. And others have been found, documented and covered back over permanently, because the decision has been made that preserving them in situ in their current sealed condition is better than the alternatives. Beneath Cumberland Street, which runs along the ridge above the original settlement, there are structures that date to the 1790s, to the very first decade of the colony. These are not merely foundation traces. Some of them are substantially intact spaces, rooms with walls that still stand close to their original height, with stone floors and, in some cases, with timber structural elements that the anaerobic conditions of their burial have preserved far beyond any reasonable expectation. They are time capsules in the most literal meaning of that phrase. The air inside them has not moved significantly in 150 years. The material left in them when they were sealed is still there. Ceramic fragments from vessels made in England and carried to the end of the world. Leather fragments from shoes and harnesses, and the ordinary equipment of lives lived in extreme conditions. Bone from meals eaten 2 centuries ago. The remains of animals butchered and cooked and eaten by people who were hungry and who had been sent to the other side of the earth against their will. These are the material traces of lives that the official record mostly did not consider worth preserving. The lives of convicts and the working poor, and the people who occupied the margins of the colonial project. They are sealed beneath a street in the oldest part of Sydney, and they are holding their contents in their darkness patiently, and nobody's allowed in. Sleep moves the way water moves in still conditions, slowly and without announcing itself. We are drifting south now, following the coastline in the direction that the prevailing winds blow ships, moving toward a city that sits at the top of a great bay, and that built itself in a hurry on the proceeds of a gold rush, and that has been trying ever since to decide what kind of city it wants to be. We are moving to Melbourne. Melbourne was settled in 1835, nearly 50 years after Sydney, which means it came into existence already knowing what a colonial city should look like. It did not have to invent itself out of desperation and convict labour. It was planned after a fashion from the beginning, laid out on a grid that the surveyor Robert Hoddle imposed on the floodplain between the Yarra River and the bay, with the confidence of a man who believed that straight lines were the solution to the problem of wilderness. The Hoddle Grid, which forms the skeleton of Melbourne's central business district today, is one of the most regular and legible urban plans in Australia, a series of wide streets intersecting at right angles with a logic so obvious that it is still essentially intact nearly 2 centuries after it was drawn. The Wurundjeri people, who were the traditional custodians of the land on which Melbourne was built, had a different relationship with that landscape. They called the river Birrarong, the river of mists, and the name speaks to something the European surveyors did not notice or did not consider relevant. The river in the early morning, in the cool seasons, produces mist in the way that warm water meeting cold air always does, and the Wurundjeri had observed this long enough to name the river for it. The land around the river was not a featureless floodplain waiting to receive a grid. It was a complex landscape of river channels and seasonal wetlands, and stands of river red gum and grassy woodland. Each element known and named and understood in relation to the others by people whose knowledge of that country extended back further than any European could calculate. The gold rush of 1851 transformed Melbourne with a speed that is almost impossible to comprehend from a contemporary perspective. Within 5 years of the discovery of gold at Ballarat and Bendigo, Melbourne had grown from a colonial outpost of a few thousand people into one of the wealthiest cities in the world. The population was drawing from England and Ireland and China and the United States and Germany and every other place where men had heard that gold could be dug from the earth of the interior and brought to the city at the end of the bay. The streets could not be built fast enough. The buildings went up in a hurry, and some of them were not made to last, and some of them were made magnificently, with the confidence of people who were certain that what they were building was permanent. What the gold rush wealth did not spend money on was the ground beneath the city. Melbourne was built on a river floodplain, on land that was seasonally waterlogged, and that sat above a complex of underground streams and springs that the original vegetation had managed efficiently, but that the developing city was rapidly making impossible to work around. Every time it rained significantly, and it rained significantly in Melbourne with regularity, the lower parts of the city flooded. The streets that were not yet paved turned into rivers of mud of a depth and consistency that required description. The waste of a rapidly growing city had nowhere to go except the lowest available places, the gutters in the river and the increasingly overwhelmed natural drainage of the floodplain. The solution that the Victorian colonial government eventually funded was one of the great civil engineering achievements of 19th century Australia. Between roughly 1870 and 1900, Melbourne built a comprehensive underground sewerage and drainage system that would serve the metropolitan area for generations. The main tunnels of this system were constructed of brick, hand-laid in courses so precisely aligned and so carefully maintained that they stand today in essentially the same condition as when they were built. The main sewer tunnel beneath Swanston Street, the central north-south axis of the city that connects the State Library to Flinders Street Station, is one of the largest and oldest of these tunnels. It is approximately 2 meters in diameter at its widest. It runs through the stone beneath the street with the patient, undemonstrative persistence of a thing that was built to do a job and has been doing it without interruption ever since. The men who built these tunnels were proud of the work. This is evident in the quality of the brickwork. Nobody outside of the engineering department and the maintenance crews was ever going to see what they built. But they built it as though it mattered how it looked, laying the bricks in courses that are still straight and tight after 130 years, maintaining the dimensional accuracy of the tunnel lining with the care of craftsmen who understood that precision in the dark was still precision. The foremen and the engineers who supervised the construction left their marks in the record books of the Melbourne Board of Works, and some of their names are preserved. The labourers who laid the bricks are not named. They are present only in the brickwork itself. During the Second World War, Melbourne's underground infrastructure was considered in relation to the threat of aerial bombardment. The city was not as exposed as Darwin, which was being regularly attacked, or as explicitly targeted as Sydney, which had a Japanese midget submarine in its harbour, but the authorities took the possibility of attacks seriously enough to assess the city's underground spaces for their defensive potential. Some sections of the Melbourne sewerage system were modified during the early 1940s. Blast doors were installed at certain tunnel junctions. Ventilation improvements were made to sections that might serve as emergency shelters. Not all of this wartime infrastructure was removed after the war ended. Some of it remains in place in the tunnel network, visible to the maintenance workers who travel through the system, the rusted evidence of a different kind of threat than the one the system was originally designed to address. There are sections of the 19th century drainage network that are no longer connected to the active system. They were decommissioned as the drainage infrastructure was upgraded and expanded over the decades, sealed at both ends with concrete facings, removed from service but not removed from the ground. They are still there in the dark beneath the city streets, their Victorian brickwork aging at the same slow rate in the same stable underground environment that has protected it since the day it was laid. They appear on the infrastructure maps maintained by Melbourne Water. Their locations are known, but they are not accessible because they run beneath buildings and train lines and streets that cannot be excavated without consequences for the infrastructure above. They are simply unused spaces in the dark beneath Swanston Street and Elizabeth Street and the lanes between them. And beneath all of this, beneath the brick-lined tunnels and the decommissioned drainage channels and the wartime blast doors, there are the buried rivers. Several of Melbourne's original watercourses were enclosed and turned into underground channels as the city expanded over them in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Moonee Ponds Creek and its lower reaches, the Elster Creek tributary, several smaller streams that drained the northern and eastern edges of the original settlement, were all turned from open watercourses into underground tunnels as their surface presence became incompatible with the development plans of the expanding city. Some of these enclosed streams were given their own brick-lined tunnels, continuous with the style and the craftsmanship of the sewer system. Others were enclosed more roughly, their banks built up and their courses covered with whatever was available. They still flow underground, carrying the drainage of their catchments through the foundations of the modern city in the directions they have always flowed, toward the Yarra and eventually toward the bay. We are moving again. The pace of this kind of travel is its own, not fast and not slow in any way that can be measured. It is the pace of attention, of moving from one thing to the next when you have spent enough time with the first thing to feel its weight and its texture and its particular quality of time. We are moving north now, following the coastline in the warm direction, watching the climate change as we go, the air warming and the vegetation shifting from the eucalyptus woodland of the Victorian coast through the mixed forests of the New South Wales highlands, and then down again to the subtropical coast, to the place where the river meets the sea in a broad estuary that the city has been building itself over for nearly 2 centuries. We are going to Brisbane. Brisbane is a city defined by its river and its heat. The river, which the Turrbal and Yagara people called Maiwar, winds through this city in a series of sweeping curves that the grid of streets has never quite been able to contain or accommodate. And the city has been in negotiation with those curves for its entire existence, building bridges across them, and flood mitigation works along them, and building directly beside them in full knowledge that the river floods and has always flooded. The heat of summer, the subtropical heat that arrives in November and stays until March, the heat that generates the afternoon thunderstorms that can drop an inch of rain in 20 minutes, shapes everything about how Brisbane is built and used and understood. The underground in that climate is not cold in the way the underground of Melbourne and Sydney is cold. It is merely cooler than the surface, a relative relief, but not the profound temperature difference that separates underground from above ground in the southern cities. The Turrbal people were the traditional custodians of the land on both sides of the river, in the area that became Brisbane, and the Yagara people held the country to the south and west. Both groups had lived in this river valley for tens of thousands of years, and their presence in the landscape has left material traces in the soil that are still being encountered whenever construction work goes deep enough to find them. Along the banks of the Maiwar, and in the low ground near the water, midden deposits have accumulated over thousands of years. The compressed remains of tens of thousands of meals, shellfish and fish bones and animal remains, building up in layers that represent the passage of generations of people using the same riverbank, returning to the same productive stretches of water season after season, because the water there was good and the gathering was reliable. These midden deposits are now beneath the city. The ones that were in the path of development have been built over, their upper layers sometimes excavated in advance of construction, and sometimes simply compressed beneath the footings of buildings. The ones that were in less intensely developed areas may be better preserved. The deep stratigraphy of the Brisbane CBD, the sequence of soil layers that descends through the colonial occupation and the early pastoral period, and then through the archaeological evidence of Aboriginal occupation, and then through the Holocene sediments and into the Pleistocene geology below, is a record of human presence in the river valley that extends back to a time when the continent looked very different, and the coastline was hundreds of kilometers to the east of where it sits today. Most of this stratigraphy is inaccessible. The deep basement levels of the CBD buildings extend down through the upper colonial layers, and in some cases through the Aboriginal occupation layers, compressing and displacing, and in the worst cases, simply destroying the material record. What survives is generally in the portions of the stratigraphy that construction work has not reached, the deeper layers, the pre-Holocene sediments, the compressed evidence of the very earliest occupation. In the few instances where emergency excavations or research projects have been able to access these deeper layers, what has been found is significant enough to suggest that the inaccessible portions contain information of considerable importance to the understanding of human prehistory in southeastern Queensland. The wartime history of Brisbane deserves extended attention, because Brisbane during the Second World War was not merely a colonial city affected by the conflict happening elsewhere. It was a strategic centre. When General Douglas MacArthur transferred his headquarters from Bataan to Australia in March of 1942, he established his Southwest Pacific Command in Melbourne, and then moved it to Brisbane in the same year as the focus of Allied operations shifted northward. From 1942 until 1944, Brisbane was the command centre for the entire Allied effort in the Southwest Pacific, and the city was transformed by that role in ways that are still visible in the fabric of the built environment if you know where to look. MacArthur's headquarters were in the AMP building on Queen Street, which was heavily reinforced and modified for its wartime function, and the basement of that building was converted into a command centre with communications equipment and protected working spaces. But the wartime underground of Brisbane extends well beyond the AMP building basement. In the Kangaroo Point Cliffs, the dramatic vertical face of volcanic rock that rises from the south bank of the river, directly across from the CBD, a series of tunnels were cut into the stone during 1942 to create protected storage for military supplies and to provide emergency shelter capacity for military personnel. The rhyolite and tuff of the Kangaroo Point cliffs are hard and stable rock, and the tunnels cut through them were substantial, some of them running for considerable distances into the cliff face and connecting to each other through cross passages. The tunnels were sealed after the war. The entrances cut into the cliff face were blocked, some with brick and some with poured concrete, and some by the simple act of allowing the overburden to slump back over them. The park that now occupies the cliff top above has been modified by subsequent development, and the original tunnel entrances are in most cases no longer identifiable from the surface or from the face of the cliff below. What remains is in the rock, sealed and stable and dark, the ammunition storage chambers and the communications rooms and the emergency shelter spaces that the military carved out of the cliff in the first desperate year of the Pacific War. We move again, and this time the movement is longer and stranger. We are crossing the continent, we are passing over the interior, over the Great Dividing Range, and the slopes and plains beyond it, over the grey-green monotony of the mulga and the red soil country and the ancient flat horizon of the outback, over the Nullarbor Plain, where the bight meets the land in a line of white cliffs so straight they look drawn. We are moving to the isolated west, to the city at the edge of the Indian Ocean that is so far from any other significant settlement that it has had to be in fundamental ways self-sufficient. We are going to Perth. Perth was established in 1829 on the banks of the Swan River, and the particular quality of its isolation, the 2,000 kilometres of desert and scrubland that separate it from the nearest comparable city, has shaped everything about how it has developed. For much of its history, Perth was a backwater, the capital of a colony that struggled to attract settlers, and that funded the construction of its public buildings, partly through the continued transportation of convicts from Britain at a time when the eastern colonies had already ended the practice. The isolation that made Perth difficult to settle has also, paradoxically, preserved some things about its urban development that the more connected eastern cities lost long ago. The Whadjuk Noongar people had lived on the Swan coastal plain for at least 45,000 years before the European settlers arrived. The Swan River, which the Noongar called Derbil Yerrigan, the estuary of the Swan, was the organising geographical feature of the entire region, and the Noongar understanding of this river and its associated landscape was extraordinarily detailed and comprehensive. The coastal plain on which Perth sits is, in its natural state, not the dry flat ground that the city's surface might suggest. It is a complex of wetlands and seasonal water bodies, a landscape of exceptional ecological richness created by the interaction of the winter rainfall, the flat terrain, and the relatively shallow water table of the coastal limestone. The Noongar managed this landscape through fire and through the detailed understanding of its seasonal dynamics that allowed them to be in the right place at the right time to take advantage of each resource as it became available. The wetlands that are now beneath the northern suburbs of Perth were significant gathering places, places where waterbirds nested and where fish moved in seasonal patterns that the Noongar could predict. The seasonal flooding of the low-lying ground was not a problem to be solved. It was a feature of the landscape that was understood and worked with. When the European settlers arrived and began to develop the Swan coastal plain, the first thing they did with the wetlands was drain them. The flat, wet ground that covered much of the coastal plain was incompatible with the kind of agriculture and urban development the settlers had in mind, and the drainage works that began in the 19th century and continued through most of the 20th progressively reduced the wetland area of the Perth metropolitan area by more than 80%. The wetlands that remain are a fraction of what existed before European settlement, and they are managed under conservation frameworks that attempt to maintain what is left. The wetlands that were drained and built over did not disappear in any fundamental sense. The hydrology of the original landscape persists beneath the surface, in the movement of the water table and the behaviour of the groundwater and the way that rainfall recharges the aquifer systems that underlie the coastal plain. Perth sits above the Nangra Mound, one of the largest unconfined aquifers in Australia, a body of underground water that extends beneath almost the entire Perth metropolitan area, and that is recharged each winter by the rainfall that soaks through the sandy coastal soils. The aquifer is not a lake or an underground river. It is the pore space in the limestone and the sand, saturated with fresh water that moves slowly westward toward the coast under the influence of gravity. Beneath the northern suburbs of Perth, the Tamala limestone that forms the aquifer is riddled with cavities created by the slow dissolution of the stone in slightly acidic groundwater over millions of years. This dissolution process is not dramatic or rapid. A cavity that might be half a metre across may have taken 100,000 years to form. But the cavities are real, and they are present throughout the northern Perth suburbs, identified in some places by collapse events that have produced sinkholes in roads and gardens and building footings, and unidentified in the many more places where they have not yet collapsed. The archaeological record beneath Perth follows the same general pattern as beneath the other capitals, with the critical difference that the calcareous soils of the coastal plain create a preservation environment that is, for certain material types, unusually favourable. Bone survives better in calcareous soils than in the acidic soils of the eastern cities. Shell survives well, In the right conditions, even plant material can be preserved in the calcium-rich sediments of the coastal plain. The middens along the Swan River and the coastal dunes contain material in these favourable conditions, and the sealed portions of the Perth archaeological record, the portions that lie beneath buildings and roads and car parks, may preserve information about the Noongar occupation of the coastal plain that would not survive in other environments. The oldest colonial infrastructure beneath Perth is concentrated in the area of the original settlement on the south bank of the Swan near the present CBD. The foundations of the earliest colonial buildings, the first government offices and the stores and the cottages of the first settlers, are in the soil beneath the modern city in various states of preservation. Some have been excavated, most have not. The depth and complexity of the colonial stratigraphy in the Perth CBD varies considerably with location, in some places reaching 2 metres or more below the current ground surface. Let us continue. We are turning back east now, but not rushing. The pace of this kind of travel is determined by attention, and we are paying attention to the ground, to what lies beneath it, to the layers of time that press against each other in the dark below the cities. We are moving back toward the centre, but taking a southern route, following the coastline of the Great Australian Bight, and turning north at the edge of the Eyre Peninsula to reach the city that was planned more carefully than any other colonial settlement on the continent. We are going to Adelaide. Colonel William Light surveyed the site for Adelaide in 1836, 1 year after Melbourne was established, and the plan he laid out for the new city was different in kind from anything else that existed in colonial Australia. Light was not simply dividing land into saleable lots. He was designing a city in the full sense of that term, creating a spatial arrangement that would support a population of tens of thousands, while also providing them with open space, with parks and gardens, and the breathing room that the crowded, industrial cities of England emphatically lacked. The central city was laid out on a strict grid of wide streets, and around it Light placed a continuous belt of parkland that separated the city from the suburban areas that would grow beyond it. The parklands were not decorative, they were structural, part of the fundamental conception of the city. This plan has survived, which is remarkable. The pressures on urban open space in a growing city are enormous and sustained, and the fact that Adelaide's parklands belt is still substantially intact 2 centuries after Light drew it speaks to the strength of the planning framework he established, and to the degree to which subsequent generations of South Australians chose to honour his vision. The parklands are still there, still open, still separating the CBD from the suburbs in a way that no other Australian capital city has preserved. The Kaurna people, who were the traditional custodians of the Adelaide Plains, called the area that would become Adelaide's city centre Tandanyanga, which refers to the Red Kangaroo Dreaming Place. The Adelaide Plains were the country of the Red Kangaroo Dreaming Path, a line of spiritual significance that ran through the landscape connecting sites of ceremony and meaning in a geography that was simultaneously physical and spiritual, present in the land and in the stories told about the land at the same time. The Dreaming Path passed through the ground, not just across it. It had depth. It connected above and below in ways that the two-dimensional language of European mapping could not express. That dreaming path runs through the foundations of the Adelaide CBD today. It moves beneath the intersections of the gridded streets, through the basement levels of the buildings, through the infrastructure tunnels of the modern city. It is not visible in any material sense. It does not show up on ground-penetrating radar. It is not the kind of thing that archaeological excavation can find. But it is present in the Kaurna understanding of the landscape, maintained in the memory and ceremony of the Kaurna people, despite everything that has been done to the surface above it. And it represents a form of engagement with the underground that is fundamentally different from the heritage archaeology, and the drainage engineering and the wartime tunnelling that we have been considering. Colonel Light's drainage infrastructure for Adelaide was among the most carefully planned of any colonial city on the continent. The flat terrain of the Adelaide Plains made drainage management a priority from the beginning, and the city's underground drainage system was developed early and with unusual thoroughness. By the 1860s and 70s, Adelaide had a network of underground drains that collected the surface water of the city centre and channeled it through brick-lined tunnels toward the Port River and the sea. The main elements of this system are still in service, maintained and periodically upgraded by the relevant authorities, but essentially unchanged in their routing and their primary construction from the form in which they were built in the 19th century. The wartime underground of Adelaide is less well known than that of Darwin or Brisbane, but it is real and it is sealed. During 1942, as the threat of Japanese attack seemed to move closer to the Australian mainland, and the possibility of bombardment of major cities was seriously considered, the South Australian government and the military authorities constructed a network of tunnels connecting several of the key institutions of the North Terrace Cultural Precinct. North Terrace is Adelaide's great boulevard of culture and knowledge, the street that carries the State Library and the South Australian Museum, and the Art Gallery of South Australia and the University of Adelaide along the northern edge of the city centre. These institutions were considered important enough to protect, and the tunnels that connected them were designed both to allow the movement of people and records between buildings during an attack, and to serve as emergency shelters. The tunnels were constructed during 1942 and 1943 in the rock beneath North Terrace. Some of them connect buildings that are still in use today for the same cultural purposes they served during the war. The tunnel between the Art Gallery and the State Library, which passes beneath the street, is still occasionally used for the movement of large artworks that cannot be transported through the public galleries. The other sections of the wartime tunnel network are less regularly used, some of them essentially sealed, their ventilation systems no longer functional, their access points restricted to maintenance personnel with specific authorization. The air in the unused sections of the Adelaide wartime tunnels has been sitting still for a very long time. In that stillness, and in the steady coolness that the underground maintains regardless of the surface temperature, the walls have developed the particular kind of damp patina that forms when air circulation is absent for decades. The concrete of the walls is damp to the touch. The steel of the blast doors, the heavy frames that were designed to seal the tunnels against blast and contamination, has corroded into positions it is unlikely ever to move from again. The emergency telephone points that were installed at intervals along the tunnel walls, the handsets that would have been used by shelter occupants to communicate with the surface, are present in their housings, their mechanisms frozen by the passage of time and the chemistry of the underground air. Nobody goes in. The ventilation is insufficient for safe occupancy. The structural assessments have not been completed. The heritage protections that apply to wartime infrastructure of this kind require careful management, and careful management takes time and resources. The tunnels wait. But the most significant thing about the Adelaide Underground is not the wartime infrastructure. It is what lies beneath the parklands. Colonel Light's great gift to the city, the open land that rings the central business district, is also the place where the deep time of the Adelaide Plains is best preserved. The Torrens River floodplain, which forms much of the northern parklands, is underlain by deep alluvial sediments that accumulated over the Pleistocene and early Holocene, deposited by the river under climatic conditions very different from those of today. Within these sediments, archaeologists have found evidence of human presence going back more than 20,000 years, to the last glacial maximum, to a time when the climate of the Adelaide region was cold and dry, and the landscape looked nothing like it does today. This evidence is in the ground beneath the parklands, accessible in principle through excavation, preserved by the relatively undisturbed character of the open space above. The decision not to build on the parklands has been, inadvertently, a decision to preserve the deepest archaeological record in the Adelaide metropolitan area. The deep time is sealed beneath the grass, waiting for the technology and the resources, and the careful attention that would be required to read it without destroying it. We are moving to the interior now. We are leaving the coast and travelling inland, following the ranges northeast through the dry country of the Murray-Darling system, through the riverine plains, and then up into the higher country of the Australian Capital Territory, to the most unusual and deliberate of all the capitals. We are going to Canberra. Canberra is strange in the way that all planned cities are strange, in the way that cities which came into existence as ideas on paper before they existed in stone and steel carry a quality of self-consciousness that older cities lack. It was selected as the site of the national capital in 1908 as a compromise between the competing ambitions of Sydney and Melbourne, neither of which was willing to yield the capital to the other. The ACT was carved out of New South Wales as a separate territory, and the design of the new city was determined by an international competition won by the American architects Walter Burley Griffin and Marion Mahoney Griffin. Their design, built around the geometry of the land and the water and the mountains, is still legible in the city today, most obviously in the formal geometry of the parliamentary triangle and the lake that was created in the middle of the city by damming the Molonglo River. The Ngunnawal people had lived in the high country that would become the ACT for thousands of years, using it as a meeting place where several language groups converged, the place where the ranges opened into a broad valley with reliable water and good resources. The limestone caves of the surrounding region, particularly the Yarrangobilly Caves in what is now Kosciuszko National Park to the south, indicate the kind of geological complexity that underlies the Canberra area. Soluble stone, potential void spaces, a geology that is not simple or uniform, that contains within it the possibility of spaces that were not put there by human hands. When the Molonglo River was dammed in the 1960s to create Lake Burley Griffin, the valley it occupied was flooded, and the landscape of small farms and homesteads that had grown up in the ACT countryside was inundated. The families who had farmed those properties were compensated and relocated, and the land they had worked was put underwater. What they left behind, the buildings and the fences and the roads and the trees they had planted, was simply left in place as the water rose. Lake Burley Griffin is not deep, rarely more than 4 meters, and in conditions of good water clarity, the outlines of the submerged landscape can be seen from a boat or a kayak. Old fence lines marked by algae growth, the low mounds of building foundations, the ghost of a road running from one inundated property to another. The people who farmed those properties in the decades before the lake was created had histories in the land that extended through the colonial period, and some of their histories connected to the Ngunnawal occupation of the valley before the colonial period. The soil record of the valley, compressed now beneath the lake sediments that have accumulated since the dam was built, holds the stratigraphic history of all of this. The upper colonial layers, the fence posts, and the building rubble, and the evidence of agricultural activity are the most recent layer. Beneath them is the record of the pastoral period and the first decades of the colony. And beneath that is the archaeology of Ngunnawal occupation of the valley, the stone tools and the hearths, and the faunal remains of people using the resources of the valley for thousands of years. All of it is sealed, first by the lake sediments above it, and then by the water above that, and then by the recreational activity on the surface of the water, the sailing and the rowing and the dragon boat races that take place above the submerged past without knowing it is there. The Cold War underground of Canberra is both the best known and the least accessible element of the city's underground history, because Canberra was the seat of the national government throughout the period when nuclear conflict was a realistic possibility. The Australian government built facilities beneath and around the city that were designed to allow the continued functioning of the state through a nuclear attack. The nature and extent of these facilities is not fully in the public domain. What is known from parliamentary records and journalistic investigation and the declassification of some relevant documents over the years is that such facilities exist, that they include command and communications infrastructure, that they are located in the ranges around the city where the geological stability and the distance from the urban centre provide the necessary conditions for protected facilities, and that they have been maintained and updated as the relevant threat assessments have evolved. The most extraordinary aspect of the Canberra Underground is this combination of the very old and the very recent, the Ngunnawal archaeology of the valley floor and the Cold War emergency facilities in the ranges, the submerged colonial farmsteads in the lake, and the classified communications infrastructure beneath the hills. It is a geology of time compressed into a relatively small area, the different layers of human engagement with a landscape that has been inhabited for thousands of years, and that was, for several decades, the place from which the entire nation was theoretically governed. Somewhere in the ranges around Canberra, there is a sealed facility that was built to preserve the continuity of Australian government through the worst thing the 20th century could do to it. Nobody says where it is. The people who know are not talking, and the eucalypts grow above it, and the granite outcrops are the same as all the other granite outcrops, and nothing on the surface gives any indication of what is underneath. We are leaving the inland capital and following the ranges down toward the coast, moving southeast across the border into New South Wales, and then continuing south through the elevated country of the Monaro, and over the border into Victoria, and then west along the coast to where the ferries cross the Bass Strait to the island state, the coldest and oldest and most intensely historical of all the Australian states, the state that was settled almost as early as New South Wales and that held its secrets in the clean cold air above the Southern Ocean. We are going to Hobart. The approach to Hobart by sea was, for most of its history, the primary approach. Ships came through the D'Entrecasteaux Channel or around the Iron Pot at the entrance of the Darwin and sailed up the river between the ranges, and the city they approached was dominated by the mountain. Coonamble, which the Europeans named Mount Wellington, stands above Hobart with a presence that no other mountain exercises over any other Australian capital. It is not particularly high by absolute measure, but it rises so sharply and so close to the water that it seems to fill the western sky, and its dolerite face changes character so completely with the weather and the light and the season that it is almost a different mountain from hour to hour. Snow on the summit in winter, clear air and the smell of eucalyptus in summer, cloud wrapping the top half of the rock in the kind of dense low cloud that comes off the southern ocean and turns the afternoon grey. The Muwinina people were the traditional custodians of the Hobart area. They had lived on the Derwent River estuary and the surrounding coast for tens of thousands of years, using the rich marine resources of the estuary and the seasonal resources of the hinterland in patterns of movement that were governed by a deep knowledge of the seasonal rhythms of a cool temperate landscape. The middens they left along the estuary shores, the accumulated remains of countless meals eaten over countless generations at the water's edge, represent the material record of that long occupation. The colonial history of Tasmania is among the most painful in Australia. The Van Diemen's land colony, established on the Derwent in 1804, grew rapidly on the basis of an economy that depended on convict labour, and the expansion of the pastoral economy into the interior led to a sustained conflict with the Aboriginal Tasmanians that the colonial government eventually escalated into the systematic campaign of removal and destruction known as the Black War. By the 1830s, the surviving Aboriginal Tasmanians had been moved to Flinders Island, and by the end of the 19th century, the colonial narrative held that the Tasmanian Aboriginal people were extinct. This was false, a comfortable lie for the settlers, and a harmful one for the Aboriginal Tasmanians whose descendants were and are still here. But it shaped the way the history of occupation and dispossession in Tasmania was told for more than a century. The Muwinina presence in the Hobart landscape is not erased by the colonial narrative of extinction. It is in the ground. The middens along Sullivan's Cove and the Derwent foreshore are sealed beneath the colonial development that covered the original shoreline, beneath the wharves and the warehouses and the roads, and eventually the high-rise buildings of the modern city. When construction work in the Hobart CBD has gone deep enough to encounter the original ground surface, it has found shell material and stone artifacts in the concentrations that indicate long-term use of the waterfront by the people who lived here before any of the current city existed. That material has been excavated under archaeological supervision in the instances where it has been encountered during construction, and then the construction has proceeded above it, sealing it again beneath new concrete and steel. The convict infrastructure of Hobart represents a layer of underground history that is distinct from the convict history of Sydney and Melbourne. Tasmania was a convict colony until 1853, and the convict labour that built the colony built it thoroughly. The roads and the bridges and the government buildings and the churches all have convict labour in their foundations. The underground works of Hobart, the drains and the cellars and the foundations, were built by men who had been transported from England for offences ranging from theft to political agitation, and they built with the particular quality of workmanship that comes from people who have no choice about the work, but who bring their own standards to it nonetheless. The Cascades Female Factory, which operated from 1828 to 1856 at the base of Kunanyi, is one of the most significant convict sites in Australia. Its story is one of the most comprehensively documented examples of the particular cruelty that the convict system directed at women and children. The women held at the Cascades Female Factory were there for a range of reasons, from having committed offences for which they had been transported to having displeased their assigned masters to having become pregnant outside of sanctioned relationships. The conditions varied by yard and by period, but the coldness and the damp at the base of the mountain and the fundamental degradation of the convict condition gave the factory a reputation that persisted long after it closed. The surface archaeology of the female factory has been partially investigated over recent years, and the site is managed as a heritage place that allows visitors to understand something of the history and the geography of the institution. But the subsurface of the site has not been fully excavated. The lower yard, where the most difficult prisoners were confined, and where conditions were at their worst, is still largely in the ground, its material history sealed beneath the surface that visitors walk across. The residues of the work done there, the oakum picking and the wool processing, and the laundry work that was the daily reality of the women's confinement, are in the soil. The material remains of the people who were held in the lower yard. The fragments of their clothing and their tools and their food are there. Nobody has excavated them. The wartime infrastructure of Hobart is sealed into a material that is, in geological terms, among the most durable on Earth. The dolerite of the Hobart hillsides and headlands is an igneous rock of exceptional hardness, formed by the intrusion of molten material into the existing sedimentary sequence hundreds of millions of years ago, and then exposed by the slow erosion of the softer rocks above it. Dolerite does not dissolve in groundwater. It does not crack and spoil the way softer stones do. It does not swell or shrink with changes in moisture. Tunnels cut through dolerite are, in structural terms, essentially permanent. The wartime tunnels at Battery Point, cut through the dolerite of the headland on the western side of the Derwent south of the CBD, are in this kind of rock, and they are, in all probability, in essentially the same structural condition as when they were built in 1942. The coastal artillery installations that they served are long gone, the guns removed after the war and the surface emplacements demolished or converted to other uses. The underground magazines and fire control centres that served those guns are in the dolerite, sealed by the concrete facings that were poured over their entrances when they were decommissioned, and they are likely to be cold and dry and absolutely dark and completely unchanged from the day the last person walked out of them. The silence in those tunnels, if you could be in it, would be the deepest kind, not the silence of a room or a building. The silence of dolerite, of ancient volcanic stone, of a rock that was formed before there were any organisms on land, and that has been sitting in the same place, more or less, ever since. The wartime history sealed into the Hobart dolerite is very recent compared to the history of the rock itself. The dolerite holds it lightly. We have one more city to visit, the last, and in many ways the most dramatic of the underground histories we are considering. We are making the longest journey of the night, crossing the entire continent from south to north, from the cold dolerite island to the tropical coast, following the route the supply ships used to take before the roads were built, past the limestone headlands of the Victorian coast and across the Spencer Gulf, and through the emptiness of the outback and into the heat and the red country and the monsoonal north. We are going to Darwin. The approach to Darwin by sea, if you were making it in the early months of 1942, would have given you a very specific and very frightening view of what a modern aerial attack could do to a city that was not prepared for it. The first wave of Japanese aircraft that struck Darwin on the morning of February the 19th arrived from the northwest over the Timor Sea, and they came in the kind of clear tropical morning that Darwin produces in its dry season. Blue sky and warm light, and the harbour glittering below them, with the ships still at their moorings because the warning of the attack had not reached the people who needed it. The first bombs fell at 9:45 in the morning. Darwin was attacked 64 times in total during the Second World War, more than any other location in Australia, and the character of those attacks shaped the city in ways that are still physically present, in the underground infrastructure that was built to protect the people and the operations that the military needed to keep functioning. The most famous of the wartime underground sites in Darwin is the oil storage tunnel complex. 8 tunnels cut through the sandstone escarpment at the harbour edge that stored aviation fuel for the Allied air operations in the Southwest Pacific. These tunnels, completed in 1942, are now a heritage site open to visitors, and they represent one of the very few instances in Australia where significant wartime underground infrastructure has been preserved and made accessible. The sandstone of Darwin is a different material from the dolerite of Hobart or the granite of the ACT ranges. It is a sedimentary rock, laid down in layers by ancient rivers and shallow seas, and it cuts relatively easily compared to igneous rocks. The oil storage tunnels were excavated by teams of labourers working around the clock in the tropical heat, and the work was urgent because the supply lines that were feeding the Allied air campaign were constantly threatened by Japanese naval activity, and because aviation fuel stored in surface tanks was completely vulnerable to aerial attack. The tunnels were the solution. Underground, the fuel was protected from anything except a direct hit on the tunnel entrance, and the tunnels were oriented to minimize that risk. The tunnels that are accessible today as the Tunnel SOS give some sense of what the underground infrastructure of wartime Darwin was like. They are tall and wide enough for a vehicle to drive through, their sandstone walls bearing the marks of the excavation tools, their floors still carrying the marks of the heavy vehicles that moved through them during the war years. They are cool, significantly cooler than the Darwin surface, even in the wet season, and the coolness feels significant in a city where the heat is a constant presence. You can understand why people who needed to think clearly and work for long hours would have valued access to an underground space, but the accessible oil tunnels are only the most visible element of the wartime underground around Darwin. The military installations at the wartime airfields that ring the city, the facilities at Winnerley and Strauss and Fenton and Livingstone, required underground storage and communications facilities of their own, and some of these were constructed in the hard laterite and sandstone of the Darwin Plateau with the same urgency and the same approximate methods as the oil storage tunnels. Not all of these facilities were comprehensively decommissioned after 1945. Some of them were sealed and recorded and are in the archives. Others were sealed and not fully recorded, and the documentation of their location and extent is incomplete. The Darwin Underground also contains something that no other Australian capital's underground contains in the same way. The sandstone escarpments and the sheltered rock faces of the Darwin region are covered with Aboriginal rock art that represents the deepest, continuously maintained artistic and ceremonial tradition anywhere on Earth. The Larrakia people, the traditional custodians of the Darwin area, are part of a cultural tradition in this landscape that extends back tens of thousands of years, and the rock art that records aspects of that tradition ranges from images made in the last century to images made in the deep Pleistocene that depict animals that no longer exist and conditions that no longer prevail. The rock art is not underground in the sense that the tunnels and the archaeological deposits are underground. It is on the surfaces of sheltered rock faces and caves and overhangs, protected by the overhang of the stone above it. But some of these surfaces are now inaccessible in ways that are not very different from being underground. The expansion of Darwin into the suburban areas south and east of the city has brought development into landscapes that contain significant rock art sites. Some of these sites were documented before they were affected by development. Others were not. Where rock surfaces have been cut or covered in the process of construction, the art that was on those surfaces has been lost or sealed. The Larrakia understanding of the land beneath Darwin is not contained in any archival document. It is carried in the community, in the memory and the ceremony and the ongoing relationship with country that has persisted through the colonial period and the wartime disruption and the cyclone of 1974 and the subsequent rebuilding of the city. The spiritual geography of the Darwin country runs through and beneath the modern city, not as a historical artifact, but as a living framework of meaning, maintained by the Larrakia despite every effort to replace it. We have made our circuit. We have visited 8 cities, and we have moved through the layers of their underground histories, from the deepest time of Aboriginal occupation and geological formation to the most recent sealed spaces of the Cold War. We have been in the Tank Stream and the Victorian Sewer Tunnels and the Kangaroo Point Cliffs and the Perth Aquifer and the Kaurna Dreaming Country and the submerged Molonglo Valley and the Hobart Dolerite and the Darwin Sandstone, and we have tried to hear what each of these places has to say about the cities above them and the people who built those cities and the people who were already there when the building began. The thing that connects all of these underground places is not simply their physical inaccessibility, though they are all inaccessible, some by law and some by physics and some by the more fundamental inaccessibility of things that have been forgotten. What connects them is the nature of what was sealed into them when the access was closed. In every city, the underground contains both the most recent and the most ancient of the city's histories. The wartime infrastructure of the 1940s sits above the colonial infrastructure of the 19th century, which sits above the Aboriginal archaeology of the Holocene and the Pleistocene. The layers press against each other, each one sealed by the construction of the one above it. The decisions about what to seal and what to leave accessible have reflected the priorities of the people making those decisions. The Tank Stream was sealed when it became an inconvenient sewer. The Kaurna Dreaming Paths were built over by surveyors who did not know or care that they were there. The Muwinina Middens were covered by a port city that needed its waterfront for commerce. The wartime tunnels were sealed when the threat that justified them passed and the resources required to maintain them were needed for other purposes. In every case, the sealing was an act of prioritization, a decision that what was above was more important, more useful, more deserving of attention than what was below. Some of those decisions were understandable given the circumstances and the knowledge available at the time. Some of them were willfully ignorant, made by people who knew that what they were sealing had value, and chose to seal it anyway because the value was assigned to others. The Aboriginal archaeology beneath every Australian capital is sealed beneath cities that were built without any legal acknowledgement of the prior ownership and custodianship of the land on which they were built. The dreaming paths of the Kaurna and the middens of the Muwinina, and the sacred sites of the Wajik and the Larrakia rock art and the Turrbal and Jagera occupation of the Brisbane River Valley are all sealed beneath infrastructure that represents an act of dispossession that has still not been fully addressed, legally or morally, or in the practical arrangements by which Australian cities are governed. The underground is patient with all of this. The stone does not know what it holds. The sediments do not remember who made them. The water table does not distinguish between the tanks of the colonial settlers and the submerged farm fences of the Molonglo Valley. The ground holds what is placed in it with perfect equanimity. It is we who have to decide what to do with what the ground holds, what to try to recover and what to leave sealed, what to interpret, and what to leave in the dark, what obligations the past places on the present. These are not comfortable questions. They are the questions that come up when you start to think carefully about what is beneath the cities you live in and walk through and depend on, and they resist easy resolution. The underground cannot be made fully accessible. The archaeology cannot all be excavated. The tunnels cannot all be opened. The dreaming paths cannot be mapped by the tools that archaeology uses to map things. Some of what is sealed will stay sealed until it decays or until it is accidentally encountered by future construction, or until technology develops that can read it without opening it. Some of it will never be accessible in any practical sense, but the knowledge that it is there changes something. The knowledge that beneath the streets of every Australian capital, beneath the coffee shops and the university buildings and the train stations and the government offices, there are layers of human engagement with the land that go back to the oldest continuous human presence anywhere on Earth. That is a knowledge that shifts the way the surface feels underfoot. The ground is not simply ground. It is a record, imperfect and incomplete, and shaped by the forces that created it, but extraordinarily long and in some ways extraordinarily detailed. The cities exist on a depth of time that they mostly do not acknowledge. The depth is there regardless. The Tank Stream flows through its sandstone tunnel beneath the Sydney CBD, and has done so for 200 years. The Victorian brick sewer beneath Swanston Street was built by craftsmen who knew it would outlast them. The Kaurna Dreaming Path runs through the foundations of the Adelaide city buildings, as it has run through the land for thousands of years. The Larrakia country extends beneath the Darwin suburb streets and the wartime oil tunnels and the sandstone surfaces, where the oldest living artistic tradition in the world is still inscribed. All of it is sealed. All of it is waiting. It is very late. You have been travelling a long way tonight, through the underground of 8 cities, through sandstone and limestone and basalt and dolerite, through colonial brick and wartime concrete and the compressed sediment of thousands of years. The journey is ending now. Not because there is nothing more to say. There is always more to say about the layers of time beneath any inhabited place, but because the night is deep enough that the saying can pause and be resumed later. Because sleep is its own kind of underground, its own sealed chamber where the material of the day is processed and stored and sometimes recovered and sometimes lost for good. Let the cities go quiet above you. Let the sounds of the surface diminish one by one, the traffic and the distant machinery and the particular urban frequency that is always present when you're in a city. And let what replaces it be the underground quiet, the quality of silence that belongs to sealed places, the silence that has the weight of earth and time in it. The tank stream is moving through its tunnel in the dark. The dolerite of the Hobart headlands is cold and still. The Gnangra Mound is holding its fresh water in the limestone below the Perth suburbs. The submerged farm fences of the Molonglo Valley are visible in clear water that is very still at this hour. The Larakia rock art is dark on the sandstone, unchanged. All of it is here. All of it has been here for as long as the things that made it have been here. All of it is sealed and patient and deep and quiet. Let the quiet come up through the floor the way cold air comes up from the ground on a clear night, slowly and without any urgency, filling the space where the day's noise was. Let it settle. Let the cities go on existing in the dark above their sealed places, and let the sealed places continue to hold what they have always held. You do not need to know everything that is beneath the ground you walk on. Some things are better held in the dark. Some knowledge is preserved by not being excavated, by being left alone in the conditions that have maintained it, by being acknowledged as present without being disturbed. The underground of Australia's cities is there. The 50,000 years of human presence is there. The convict work, and the colonial engineering, and the wartime urgency, and the Cold War fear are all there, and the dreaming paths are there, running through the stone beneath the cities as they have always run, as patient as the stone itself, as deep as the country that holds them. Sleep now. The ground is quiet beneath everything. The sealed places are sealed. The cities are resting on their histories, and the night is as deep and as still and as ancient as anything that has ever been placed in the dark and left to wait. There are other things to say about Sydney before we leave it, because the underground of a city this old and this large is never simple, never just one thing. The sandstone of the Sydney Basin is not a uniform rock. It varies in its composition and its structure from place to place, harder in some areas and softer in others, fractured along joints and bedding planes that create natural passages and cavities that exist independently of anything human beings have done with them. The city is built on a rock that is itself riddled with spaces, with the horizontal bedding planes of the Hawkesbury sandstone creating natural ledges and overhangs that were, for thousands of years before the colony, used as shelters by the Gadigal and the other people of the Sydney Basin. Some of these rock shelters contain Aboriginal art. The engravings that are the predominant form of rock art in the Sydney region, carved into the sandstone surfaces using stone tools and the patient action of repeated work, are distributed throughout the Greater Sydney area on surfaces both elevated and at ground level, and some of them are beneath the modern city, in the sense that the urban development that surrounds them has brought buildings and roads to within a few meters of surfaces that carry art thousands of years old. The engravings that remain visible and accessible in places like Ku-ring-gai Chase National Park to the north of the city give some indication of what exists beneath the urban fabric, in the sealed and covered outcrops where the surface was not checked or recorded before it was covered. In a city the size of Sydney, with its complex topography of ridges and gullies carved into the sandstone, the probability that significant rock art sites exist beneath the built fabric of the urban area is not a remote possibility. It is a near certainty. The systematic recording of Aboriginal sites that preceded urban development was not conducted with anything approaching completeness in the decades when most of the city was built. The framework of heritage protection that now requires consideration of Aboriginal sites before development proceeds was not in place for most of the 20th century, and the construction that happened in that period was not constrained by it. There are sandstone outcrops beneath buildings in the inner west and the inner south and the eastern suburbs of Sydney that were never systematically examined before the buildings were constructed above them. What is on the surfaces of those outcrops, if anything, is not known. The water beneath Sydney is also worth more attention than we have given it. The tank stream is the most famous of the buried waterways, but it is not the only one. Several smaller streams that drained the sandstone ridges of the original settlement were enclosed and buried as the city expanded, their surface channels replaced by underground drains that continue to carry their flows in the directions the original streams established. In some places, these buried streams create conditions of differential settlement, where the soft alluvial material in the original stream bed settles at a different rate than the surrounding sandstone, causing cracking and movement in the buildings above them. The engineers who investigate foundation problems in Sydney's older suburbs sometimes trace the cause of a damaged building back to a stream that was buried a century ago, and that continues to behave as streams do, undercutting and settling and moving slowly toward the sea. There is a stillness to thinking about the water beneath Sydney, the tank stream carrying its thin current of urban rainwater through the old sandstone tunnel, and the smaller buried streams following their original courses through the fills and the foundations, and beneath all of these the water table itself, the deep groundwater in the sandstone and the shales below it, all of it moving slowly, all of it patient, all of it entirely indifferent to the extraordinary accumulation of human activity on the surface above. The water has been finding its way to the harbour since long before the city was there, and it will continue to find its way to the harbour long after. The city is a temporary arrangement on a surface that the water owns in a more fundamental sense than any legal instrument can establish. We should also spend a moment with the deeper time of Sydney before we leave, with the geology that underlies the sandstone and that is itself the product of processes so ancient that they barely register on any scale of time that human experience can grasp. The Sydney Basin is a structural depression in the Earth's crust that formed during the Permian period, approximately 270 million years ago, when the ancient supercontinent of Gondwana was still intact and the land that would become Australia was joined to what would become Antarctica and South America. The rocks that underlie the basin were laid down in that environment, river and deltaic sediments accumulating in the depression over millions of years, eventually being buried and compressed into the Hawkesbury Sandstone and the underlying formations. The coal measures that lie beneath the sandstone across much of the Sydney Basin are the compressed and transformed remains of the Permian forests that grew in the lowlands of ancient Gondwana, their carbon preserved in the rock for 270 million years. Sydney is a city built on an archive so deep that the human record in its upper layers becomes almost invisible against the geological background. The 50,000 years of Aboriginal occupation, the 230 years of European settlement, the layers of archaeology sealed beneath the rocks and beneath the Cumberland Street Ridge and beneath the wharves and the warehouses, all of it together amounts to a thin film on the surface of a record that extends downward for 270 million years. The coal beneath the city, the Permian forest compressed into seams that can be mined, the time that the rock itself contains. In Melbourne, there are also things we have not yet said, details that the city's underground history contains, and that are worth dwelling on for a moment before we continue. The gold rush produced underground spaces in Melbourne that have nothing to do with drainage or sewerage. The banks and merchants of the gold rush era required secure storage for the gold that was being brought into the city from the fields, and the vaults that were built in the 1850s and 1860s beneath the major commercial buildings of Collins Street and Bourke Street were constructed to a standard of security and permanence that equals or exceeds anything built for the same purpose today. Some of these vaults are still in use, in modified form, beneath the buildings that succeeded the original gold rush structures. Others are sealed, the buildings above them having been demolished and rebuilt in ways that made the original vaults inaccessible or unnecessary. The Collins Street precinct, which was Melbourne's financial heart during the gold rush era, and remained the centre of its banking industry for more than a century, sits above a stratum of 19th century vault architecture that represents a significant and largely unexamined element of the city's underground history. The vaults were not built to be beautiful, but they were built to be strong, and the granite and bluestone of which they were constructed is likely to be in very good condition, sitting in the stable underground environment that has protected it from the weathering that affects surface stone. Melbourne's underground is also shaped by its geology in ways that are specific to the volcanic plains on which much of the metropolitan area is built. The western suburbs of Melbourne are underlain by basalt from the eruption of volcanoes that were active as recently as 8,000 years ago, in the context of human occupation of the area. The Wurundjeri people lived in a landscape where volcanism was a living memory, where the lava plains that covered much of the western country were recent enough to be incorporated into the oral record of what had happened to the land. The caves and lava tubes that the basalt flows created as they cooled, some of which survive in the outer western suburbs and in the plains country beyond them, were known to the Wurundjeri and were used as shelters and as places of significance. The lava tubes of the western volcanic plains are among the least known of the underground spaces associated with Australian capitals, because they are outside the urban core and outside the heritage and archaeological frameworks that focus on the densely developed areas. Some of them are on private land, known only to the landowners above them. Others have been damaged or destroyed by the agricultural and urban development of the plains. The ones that survive intact are extraordinary. Long tunnels of basalt with smooth, lava-sculpted walls and ceilings. Completely dark and completely quiet, the preserved conduits of ancient lava flows that moved across the plains when the continent looked quite different from the way it looks today. And then there is the specific underground history of the Melbourne CBD itself, which extends below the drainage tunnels and the gold rush vaults to the original ground surface of the settlement, the surface that Robert Hoddle's surveyors walked across in 1837 when they laid out the grid of the new town. That original surface is now buried beneath a variable thickness of made ground, the accumulated fill of nearly 2 centuries of urban development, and in places where excavation has gone deep enough to reach it, the original land surface of the Melbourne settlement has been found intact, with the material evidence of the first years of the town preserved in the waterlogged sediments that the original floodplain conditions maintained. When Brisbane sends us north through Queensland toward its river and its heat, we should think about the deep time more specifically. The Turrbal and Yagara people's presence in the Brisbane River Valley extends back through the entire Holocene, through the period when the river established its current course after the stabilization of sea levels following the last ice age. Before the sea level stabilized, the Brisbane River was a different river, flowing through a valley that extended much further seaward than the current coastline, and the people who lived in that landscape were living in conditions very different from those of the historical period. The archaeology of that earlier period, the Pleistocene occupation of the valley when the environment was cooler and the sea was distant, is in the deep sediments of the river valley, pressed below the Holocene record by 10,000 years of subsequent deposition. This deep archaeology, the record of the people who lived in the Brisbane River Valley before the end of the last ice age, is preserved in conditions that make it very difficult to access. It is deep, sometimes many meters below the current ground surface. It is often waterlogged, which both preserves certain material types and makes excavation extremely challenging. And it is beneath the modern city, which means that any attempt to excavate it requires either the demolition of existing infrastructure or access through the basements of existing buildings, neither of which is straightforward. There are a few places in the Brisbane metropolitan area where the deep Pleistocene archaeology is more accessible, where the geometry of the river and the floodplain has brought the oldest layers closer to the surface. These places are known to archaeologists who work in the region, and they have been partially investigated. What has been found in those investigations suggests that the occupation of the Brisbane Valley is much longer and much more complex than the archaeological record visible from the surface would suggest. The deep time is there, in the sediment, telling a story that is only beginning to be read. In Perth, the water tells its own long story. The Nangaramount aquifer that underlies the metropolitan area is recharged by rainfall, but the water that currently exists in the aquifer is not all recent. In the deeper portions of the aquifer, where the stone is less permeable and the water moves more slowly, there is water that has been underground for centuries. Water that fell as rain on the coastal plain when the land above it was covered in the native vegetation that has mostly been removed, and when the people who walked above it were the Noongar and nobody else. This old water is chemically different from the modern water, its isotopic composition recording the climatic conditions under which the rain that became it originally fell. It is a very slow kind of archive, holding information about the climate of the past in its chemistry. The limestone geology of the northern suburbs creates the conditions for a kind of underground life that is rare in Australia. Troglobitic organisms that have adapted to live permanently in underground limestone cavities, have been found in the cave systems of the Perth metropolitan area. Small crustaceans, blind beetles, specialized invertebrates that have evolved in complete darkness over millions of years, living in the water and on the surfaces of the limestone cavities. These organisms are extraordinary records of the geological history of the caves they inhabit, their evolutionary divergence from surface relatives tracking the gradual isolation of the cave environment as the limestone sealed above them. They are found nowhere else on Earth. They are sealed in the limestone beneath the Perth suburbs, in the spaces that also produce the sinkholes and the subsidence events that the geological hazard maps try to document. The Noongar relationship with the wetland landscape of the Swan coastal plain was not simply practical, not simply a matter of knowing where the fish were and when the birds nested. It was ceremonial and spiritual, embedded in a framework of obligation and knowledge that governed not just what could be taken from the land, but how and when and by whom. The wetlands were not resources. They were country, in the full sense that the Noongar used that word. Country that carried responsibilities as well as rights, that demanded certain behaviours from the people who belonged to it. The drainage of those wetlands in the process of building Perth was not simply an environmental alteration. It was a disruption of a framework of relationship that extended back through thousands of years of accumulated knowledge. The sealed wetland beneath the Perth suburbs, the accumulation of sediment in a basin that was once a living body of water, and that is now a compressed record of the lives of the people and the plants and the animals that gathered there, holds something of that relationship in its chemistry and its biology. The pollen grains preserved in the sediment record the vegetation that grew around the water. The seeds and the plant fragments record the species that were present. The animal bones and the shellfish fragments and the hearth charcoal record the human presence. Together, they constitute an archive of a relationship between people and place that is gone from the surface, but that persists in the dark below it, sealed and patient, waiting for the attention that it deserves. In Adelaide, we should dwell a little longer on the counter understanding of the landscape before we move on, because it illuminates something important about the nature of what has been sealed beneath all of these cities. The European concept of heritage, the framework through which the colonial governments and their successors have attempted to identify and protect the significant elements of the past, is fundamentally a material concept. It is concerned with objects and structures and sites, with things that can be identified and classified and managed. The counter concept of country, of the spiritual geography that connects the surface and the subsurface and the living and the ancestral, does not separate into those categories. The dreaming path that runs through the Adelaide CBD is not simply a route marked on a map. It is a connection between sites of significance, a line of energy and meaning that passes through the land itself, above and below, in the physical and in the spiritual dimension simultaneously. When the buildings of Adelaide were constructed on the land through which this path runs, the construction did not sever the connection. The path continues. It passes through the foundations and the basements and the drainage tunnels as it passed through the open land before the city was built. But the people above it are no longer aware of it, no longer oriented by it, no longer conducting the ceremonies that maintain the relationship between the living community and the country through which the path runs. This kind of sealing is different from the sealing of a tunnel or a vault or an archaeological deposit. It is the sealing of a living relationship, the covering over of a connection that was maintained, not in stone or brick or sediment, but in practice, in ceremony, in the ongoing presence of people who knew the land and were known by it. The material archaeology of the colonial occupation of the Adelaide Plains is in the ground, accessible in principle to the tools of archaeological investigation, but the living relationship that gave that occupation its meaning was not made of material that can be excavated. It persists in the colonial community, maintained through the dispossession and the destruction, carried forward by people who have never stopped knowing that the dreaming path runs through the foundations of a city that was built on their country. Canberra's relationship with the underground is also coloured by something that we have not yet discussed fully, which is the extraordinary natural landscape of the ACT, and the way that landscape preserves evidence of its geological and biological past. The Tidbinbilla Nature Reserve, to the southwest of Canberra, contains rock formations that are among the oldest on the continent, metamorphic and igneous rocks that have been dated to more than 1 billion years before the present, remnants of the ancient basement of the continent that underlies the younger rock sequences almost everywhere else. These ancient rocks are not sealed in any meaningful sense. They are exposed at the surface of the reserve and accessible to anyone who walks there, but they represent a depth of time that makes even the deep Aboriginal archaeology seem recent, a reminder that the continent itself is an archive of almost unimaginable depth. The cave system in the Urangabili Caves area, which lies to the south of Canberra in what is now Kosciuszko National Park, is partly accessible to visitors and partly not. The accessible portions of the cave system are among the most extensively decorated limestone caves in the southern part of the continent, with formations of calcite and aragonite that have been growing in the cave environment for hundreds of thousands of years. The inaccessible portions of the system, the passages that have not been opened for tourist access, the extensions of the cave system that the geological mapping has identified but that have not been physically entered, are sealed in the practical sense by their location and their small dimensions, and they continue to accumulate their formations in the dark without any human observation. The relationship between the Canberra area and the limestone cave country to its south is one of the underground connections that tends to be overlooked in discussions of the national capital's environment. The water that falls on the high country of the ACT and the surrounding areas makes its way into the limestone aquifers of the Snowy Mountains region through a complex of underground passages and permeable rock, and the caves that travellers visit at Urangabili are the accessible portion of a karst system that extends through the landscape in ways that surface observation cannot fully reveal. The underground of the Canberra region is not defined by the built infrastructure of the capital alone. It includes the deep karst of the mountains and the ancient basement rocks of the reserve and the fossil record that accumulates in the sediments of every cave and every enclosed depression and every sealed basin in the landscape. In Hobart, the convict history has a particular density and a particular weight that we should spend more time with. The female factory at Cascades was not the only institution of convict incarceration in the Hobart area. The penitentiary chapel in Brisbane Street, which is now a heritage site and visitor attraction, was the centre of the convict religious and legal system, the place where prisoners were tried and sentenced, and where they heard the services that the authorities required them to attend. The chapel and the adjoining complex of cells and exercise yards contain underground spaces that were used for solitary confinement and punishment, spaces cut into the stone beneath the floor of the institution that were dark and damp and effectively sealed from the outside world for as long as their occupants were placed there. Some of these underground punishment spaces can be visited as part of the heritage experience of the penitentiary chapel. They have been made safe and lit and interpreted, the darkness removed and the conditions ameliorated until what remains is an impression of what the spaces were rather than the thing itself. This is the necessary compromise of heritage interpretation, the transformation of the inaccessible past into something that can be approached and understood without too much discomfort. The spaces that have been interpreted are no longer sealed, but the transformation required to make them accessible has also changed them, removed the specific quality of sealed darkness and cold and silence that was the point of their construction. The archaeological record of the convict period in Hobart extends well beyond the institutions that have been identified and interpreted as heritage sites. The convict town of the early 19th century was extensive and complex, covering most of what is now the inner city and the ordinary infrastructure of that town. The wells and the privies and the rubbish pits and the road surfaces and the foundations of the workers' cottages and the small commercial buildings is in the soil beneath the modern city, in the same condition as the equivalent infrastructure of the Sydney Rocks area and the Melbourne CBD. Where it has been encountered during construction, it has been found to be well preserved in the anaerobic conditions of the Hobart soils, which are cold enough and wet enough to retard the decay that would destroy organic material in warmer, drier environments. The cold of the Hobart underground is something you can feel in the exposed sections of the city's older cellars and foundations. The basalt cobbles of the colonial-era road surfaces, where they have been exposed during construction monitoring, are cold even in summer, retaining the temperature of the deep ground through which they have been sitting. The sandstone blocks of the early colonial buildings are the same temperature underground as in the deep bedrock, a temperature that reflects the mean annual temperature of the Hobart region, and that varies very little with the seasons. This stability of temperature is one of the reasons the underground of Hobart preserves its organic material so well, and it is also one of the qualities that makes the sealed spaces of the wartime and convict periods feel, when they are encountered, so completely removed from the warmth and the light of the surface. Darwin's underground contains one more layer that we should visit before we conclude. The Darwin Harbour area, the stretch of coastline from East Point around to the Casuarina coast, contains a series of Aboriginal sites that represent the most recent evidence of the very long Larrakia occupation of the harbour country. The Larrakia people used the harbour and the coastal resources of the Darwin area in patterns of seasonal movement that took advantage of the distinct wet and dry seasons of the tropical climate, moving between the coast and the inland country as the availability of resources shifted through the year. The archaeological sites along the harbour coast record this seasonal use, with midden deposits and artefacts scattered at the locations where people gathered to exploit the coastal resources of the dry season, when the sea was calm and the shellfish were large and the fish were predictable. Some of these sites are sealed beneath the development that has occurred along the Darwin waterfront over the past 50 years. The waterfront precinct, which was developed in the early 2000s on reclaimed land adjacent to the harbour, was constructed over ground that had been used as a port and industrial area for most of the 20th century. And beneath the port infrastructure, there are the traces of the original harbour shoreline and the Larrakia use of it. The depth at which these traces lie varies, and in some areas the port development of the 20th century removed the archaeological material before the reclamation was built on top. In other areas, where the fill was placed directly over the original shoreline sediments, the archaeological material is sealed beneath the reclamation and awaiting the attention that heritage frameworks may eventually require. The most recent development of the Darwin waterfront is built on ground that is, in its original natural form, intertidal zone, the zone between the high and low water marks of the extraordinary tides that the Darwin harbour produces. The tidal range in Darwin is among the largest in Australia, sometimes exceeding 7 metres between low and high water, and the intertidal zone that this range creates is a band of significant ecological productivity that was intensively used by the Larrakia for fishing and gathering. The reclaimed land that now supports Darwin's entertainment and conference facilities was, 50 years ago, tidal flat, exposed at low water and covered at high water, a place where the Larrakia went for food and where the evidence of that use accumulated in the sediments over thousands of years. That evidence is sealed beneath the reclamation now, compressed beneath the fill and the concrete, in conditions that may or may not have preserved it, depending on the specifics of how the reclamation was done. It is not accessible, it is not being monitored. It sits in the dark beneath a precinct designed for leisure and entertainment, holding within it the material traces of a way of using the harbour that was ancient when the first European ships appeared at the harbour entrance. It is worth thinking in these final moments of the night about the specific geography of each city's relationship with its underground. Each of the 8 capitals has a different quality of depth, a different character of what lies below, determined by the specific geology and the specific history and the specific choices that were made in each place about what to preserve and what to cover over. Sydney has a depth that is architectural and aquatic simultaneously. The sandstone that underlies it is both the material from which the earliest colonial buildings were constructed and the natural channel that directed the tank stream to the harbour. The underground of Sydney is full of cut stone, colonial stonework, and natural stone interleaved, the made and the geological so closely integrated that they are difficult to separate. The cellars beneath the rocks are cut into the same sandstone that forms the harbour walls. The tank stream flows in a tunnel whose walls are the natural stone of its original valley. Sydney's underground is a continuous conversation between the geological and the architectural. Melbourne's underground is industrial, in the most honourable sense of that word. It is a monument to the Victorian conviction that engineering could solve every problem, that the right application of brick and mortar and mathematical precision could tame any landscape and direct any natural process to the service of human needs. The sewer tunnels are the most honest buildings in Melbourne, buildings that were made with great care and skill for a purpose that was wholly practical, that have performed that purpose without interruption for 130 years, and that will continue to perform it for 130 more. Brisbane's underground is riverine. It is shaped by the curves of the Maiwar and by the qualities of the alluvial sediment that the river has deposited over thousands of years in the valley it occupies. The archaeology is in the river sediment. The aboriginal middens are at the river's edge. The wartime tunnels are in the rock of the riverbank cliffs. Brisbane's underground is organised around the river the way Brisbane's surface is organised around the river. Everything oriented toward and away from the great curving waterway that defines the city. Perth's underground is geological, in the most primary sense. It is defined by the aquifer and the limestone and the ancient basement geology of the Yilgarn Craton, one of the oldest stable landmasses on Earth. Perth sits on very old ground, and its underground reflects that age in the character of the stone beneath it, the limestone full of its fossils and its cave systems, the deep basement full of the mineral wealth that has been the foundation of the Western Australian economy. The underground of Perth is not just the underground of a city, it is the underground of a continent. Adelaide's underground is ordered and patterned, the way the city itself is ordered and patterned. Colonel Light's grid imposed a geometry on the surface, and the geometry extends downward into the drainage infrastructure and the wartime tunnels and the regular layout of the colonial cellars and foundations. But beneath the order of the colonial underground, the corner-dreaming paths run in their own geometry, the geometry of the land as it was understood before the grid was drawn, and this older geometry does not align with the newer one. The two patterns coexist in the Adelaide underground, the colonial grid and the dreaming paths, each following its own logic, neither cancelling the other. Canberra's underground is the underground of a planned absence, a place that was deliberately left undeveloped at the surface and that therefore preserves more of its original underground character than any of the other capitals. The parklands and the lake and the reserves that surround the city have allowed the subsurface to remain relatively undisturbed, and the archaeology of Ngunnawal occupation is better preserved in the Canberra area than the equivalent archaeology is in the more densely developed capitals. The underground of Canberra is a reminder that preservation sometimes happens by default, through the accident of open space above, rather than through any deliberate heritage decision. Hobart's underground is cold and dense and compressed. The dolerite of the headlands and the sediments of the inner city, and the waterlogged organic material of the convict-era deposits are all preserved in the particular conditions of the Hobart climate, cold and damp, unfavourable to the bacteria that would otherwise degrade organic material. The underground of Hobart holds its contents more completely than the underground of the warmer cities, and this completeness gives it a quality of intensity, a sense that the past is closer to the surface here than elsewhere. Darwin's underground is hot in the geological sense. The tropical climate that generates Darwin's extraordinary storms and its months of heat and humidity does not penetrate far into the ground, but it shapes the conditions at the interface between the surface and the underground in ways that affect the preservation of material there. The sandstone is warm, the surface of the ground is warm, the archaeology at the near surface level is in conditions that are less favourable to preservation than the deeper and cooler underground of the southern cities. But the Darwin underground compensates for this with its extraordinary rock art, its wartime infrastructure, and the extraordinary depth of the Laraki occupation of the harbour country. These 8 undergrounds are different from each other, in the ways that the cities above them are different from each other, shaped by the same forces of geography and history and human choice that shape the surface. And they are alike in the fundamental way that all undergrounds are alike. They are dark, and they are old, and they hold what has been placed in them with perfect fidelity, and they are patient in the way that only the very deep or the very permanent can be patient. There is a practice among some of the people who work with underground spaces, the archaeologists and the engineers and the heritage managers who spend their professional lives thinking about what lies beneath cities, of standing above a sealed place and simply acknowledging its presence. Not doing anything about it, not making plans or filing reports or initiating assessments. Just knowing it is there and acknowledging that knowledge. Just standing on the surface above a sealed tunnel or a buried midden or a covered vault, and allowing the thought that something's beneath your feet, that the ground has a depth beyond its immediate surface, that the present is standing on the past in a literal as well as a metaphorical sense. This is the practice we have been engaged in tonight. Moving through the 8 underground histories has been a form of this acknowledgement, a way of standing in the imagination, above the sealed places and knowing they are there, not claiming access to them, not asserting rights over them that we do not have. Just knowing, just feeling the depth of the ground beneath the cities and allowing that depth to be present in the way that only attention can make things present. The 8 cities rest on their undergrounds with the same equanimity they always have. The surface does not change because someone on it knows what lies beneath. The tank stream continues to flow through its sandstone tunnel. The dolerite of the Hobart headlands remains cold and still. The Perth aquifer moves its ancient water through the limestone in the dark. None of this is changed by attention, but attention changes the one who pays it. And that is what we have been doing tonight. paying attention to what is sealed and deep and old and patient beneath the surfaces of the cities we inhabit. There is something about the way that underground history accumulates that deserves more thought before we finish with any of these cities. The layers press against each other in ways that create not just a vertical sequence, but a series of relationships. The earlier layer affected by what comes after it, the later layer shaped by the geography and the materials of what came before. When archaeologists describe a stratigraphy, they are not just describing a sequence in time. They are describing a set of conversations between periods, each one acting on the next, each one carrying within it the residues and the structural consequences of everything below. In Sydney, the tank stream shaped the development of the colonial city in ways that persisted long after the stream was buried. The gully through which it ran was a topographic feature that the colonial planners could not simply ignore, and the street pattern of the early settlement was oriented partly in response to the gully's presence. When the stream was enclosed and the gully was filled, the street pattern it had influenced remained, and so the buried stream continued to shape the surface of the city through the streets that had been aligned to accommodate it, even after it became invisible. The relationship between the underground and the surface continued even after the direct connection was severed. This is a pattern you can find in every one of the cities we are considering. In Melbourne, the buried waterways of the original floodplain continue to influence the behaviour of the land surface above them, creating patterns of differential settlement that the buildings and the streets must accommodate. In Brisbane, the curves of the Maiwar River that the surveyors could not straighten out of the landscape continue to organise the bridges and the ferry routes and the parkland reserves that follow the river's edges. In Perth, the wetland depressions that were drained and built over persist as low-lying areas where stormwater accumulates and where the foundation problems are most acute, the ghost hydrology of the original landscape visible in the infrastructure challenges of the modern city. The underground speaks to the surface in these indirect ways, through the problems it causes, through the patterns it imposes on what is built above it, through the occasional and dramatic moment when a sinkhole opens or a foundation fails, and the depth reveals itself directly. The cities have been trying to manage these conversations for as long as they have existed, and the management is never complete. The underground will not stay managed. It responds to what the surface does to it, to the changes in drainage and the changes in load and the changes in groundwater chemistry that 2 centuries of urban development have produced, and its responses are sometimes manageable and sometimes not. What the underground does not do is forget. It holds what has been placed in it with perfect fidelity. The organic material in the Hobart convict era deposits does not decide to decay faster. The Aboriginal engravings on the Sydney sandstone do not fade more quickly because a building has been constructed above them. The Victorian brickwork of the Melbourne sewers does not deteriorate any faster because the street above it carries more traffic than it did in 1885. The underground is indifferent to the passage of time in the way that only the very deep or the very cold or the very complete darkness can be indifferent. It simply maintains what it has maintained in the conditions that have prevailed since the last time it was opened, until those conditions change. When you think about this from the perspective of the long night, from the perspective of trying to understand what it means that all of these things are sealed beneath the cities above them, the quality of the underground's preservation starts to feel almost like a form of patience, as though the sealed places are waiting for the surface to be ready to hear what they have to say. This is not a literal description of anything that the stone or the sediment actually does. The stone is not waiting, the sediment has no intentions. But from the human perspective, from the perspective of someone thinking about these places in the quiet of a late night, the image of patient waiting is not entirely wrong. The sealed places will be there when we are ready for them. They will contain what they have always contained. The preparation is entirely on the surface. In the geological deep time that underlies all of the human archaeology we have been discussing, the patience is even more extreme. The Permian coal beneath Sydney has been there for 270 million years, and will be there, unless it is mined, for another 270 million years or more. The dolerite of the Hobart headlands was intruded into the sedimentary rock of Tasmania during the Jurassic period, approximately 180 million years ago, and it is among the most stable rock types on the continent. The ancient basement rocks of the ACT, the metamorphic and igneous rocks of the Tidbinbilla area that predate the formation of complex animals on Earth, are as close to permanent as anything in the human experience of time can be. Against this background, the human history that we have been considering, the 50,000 years of Aboriginal occupation, and the 230 years of European settlement and the specific acts of sealing that have occurred in each of these cities becomes very small. This is not to diminish the importance of what has been sealed or the questions that the sealing raises. It is simply to place it in the context of the timescale that the continent itself represents, to acknowledge that the ground beneath the cities is not merely the ground beneath the cities. It is a record that begins before there were any organisms on land, and that will continue long after the cities above it have ceased to exist. This is perhaps the most calming thought that the underground history of Australian cities has to offer. Everything that has been placed in the ground, everything that has been sealed there by intention or by accident or by the simple passage of time, is held in the context of a record so long that the longest human history is barely visible within it. The tank stream is a thin mark in the sandstone. The Kana dreaming path is a line of spiritual connection in a landscape that has been changing for millions of years. The wartime tunnels are very recent excavations in rock that was there long before the continent was recognizable in its current form. The underground holds all of it with perfect equanimity, in the same darkness, at the same temperature, with the same patience. The darkness is the constant. Everywhere we have been tonight, in the tank stream and the Melbourne sewers, and the Kangaroo Point tunnels, and the Perth limestone cavities, and the Hobart dolerite and the Darwin sandstone, the defining quality is darkness. Complete, absolute darkness. The kind of darkness that has no gradations. That is the same at 5 centimeters and 5 meters from the nearest source of light. Human beings rarely experience this kind of darkness. The environments in which we spend our time have some source of light, ambient or artificial, and our eyes adjust to find it. In the sealed underground spaces, there is nothing to adjust to. The darkness is the environment. And in that darkness, the sounds are different. The vibration of the city above is there, in the tunnel walls and the ceiling stones, but it is filtered and deepened and made into something less like noise and more like the memory of noise. A train passing over a tunnel junction is a change in the quality of the silence, a brief increase in the background vibration, and then the silence resumes. It does not sound like a train, it sounds like the passage of something large and heavy through a medium that transmits vibration, and by the time you have thought about what that means, it is already over. The water, where there is water, has its own sound in the underground darkness. It is a very clean sound, water moving over stone or moving through a small aperture, the kind of sound that the ear concentrates on in the absence of any other sound because it is the most regular and the most present thing available. In the tank stream tunnel, the sound of the water over the stone floor is the defining sound, the thing that would tell you in the darkness that you were somewhere specific rather than somewhere generic. Each sealed waterway has its own acoustic character, determined by the geometry of the space and the flow rate and the nature of the surface over which the water moves, and these acoustic characters are as distinctive as fingerprints to the people who know them. There are people who study these things, who spend their professional lives thinking about the underground spaces of cities and what they contain and what they mean for the management of the cities above them. They are hydrologists and geotechnical engineers and urban archaeologists and heritage managers and speleologists, and they work in the spaces between disciplines, in the areas where the geology intersects with the archaeology, and the archaeology intersects with the heritage law, and the heritage law intersects with the engineering, and the engineering intersects with the geology again. They are the people who know where the tank stream runs and what condition the Victorian brickwork is in, and where the Kangaroo Point tunnels are, and how stable the Perth limestone cavities are, and what the female factory yard contains, and how deep the Molonglo Valley sediments go, and where the Larakia occupation sites are along the Darwin Harbour coast. These people exist in a condition of knowing that is unusual. They know what is under the cities, or some portion of what is under the cities, and they spend their working lives with that knowledge, advising the developers and the planners and the heritage authorities about what the ground contains and what it requires. They are the intermediaries between the surface and the underground, the people through whom the sealed places communicate with the city above them in the practical language of risk assessment and heritage significance and engineering constraints. Their work is patient work. It is work that proceeds at the pace of investigation and documentation and assessment and consultation, the pace of institutional process rather than the pace of curiosity. A significant archaeological find in the path of a construction project does not stop the construction. It triggers a process of assessment and negotiation, and managed excavation and documentation and reburial that may take months or years, and that is always in tension with the schedule and the cost of the development above it. The underground is not given the time it deserves. It is given the time that the surface can afford to spare. This is the fundamental tension of urban heritage management. The past is in the ground, and the present is on the surface, and they are in competition for the same space. Every basement car park is a decision, made or unmade, about what to displace. Every new building foundation is a negotiation with the stratigraphy beneath it. Every infrastructure upgrade is a choice between efficiency and preservation. The cities make these decisions constantly, every day, as the development continues and the ground is opened and closed again, and the underground absorbs the decisions made above it with the same perfect equanimity it has always maintained. The sealed spaces are the ones where the negotiation went in a particular direction, where the decision was made, for whatever reason, to close the access and cover the entrance and let the past rest in the dark below the present. Some of those decisions were right, or at least understandable. Some of them were wrong, or at least regrettable. None of them are permanent in the absolute sense. The sealed tunnels can be reopened if the will and the resources are available. The covered archaeology can be excavated if the conditions are right. The sealed vaults can be opened if someone with the key and the authority chooses to open them. What is sealed does not have to stay sealed forever. This is perhaps the most hopeful thought that the underground history of Australian cities contains. The tank stream is still there, and the technology to monitor and document it without disturbing it is improving. The Aboriginal archaeology beneath the 8 capitals is still there, and the legal frameworks that govern its management are still evolving toward greater recognition of its significance and the rights of the communities whose heritage it represents. The wartime infrastructure is still there, and the passage of time is bringing it within the scope of heritage protection, rather than leaving it as merely decommissioned military surplus. The cities are changing in their relationship with what lies beneath them, slowly, imperfectly, with all the complications that attend any process of institutional change, but changing. Sydney has designated the tank stream as a heritage item and maintains it as infrastructure rather than simply as a drain. Melbourne incorporates the history of the Gold Rush vaults into the heritage interpretations of its CBD buildings. Brisbane has established archaeological protocols for construction in the River Valley that attempt to identify significant material before it is destroyed. Perth has created mechanisms for the recognition of Noongar sacred sites within the planning system. Adelaide has engaged the Kaurna community in the management of the dreaming paths that run through the city. Canberra has begun the process of documenting the submerged heritage of the Molonglo Valley. Hobart has preserved the female factory as a heritage site and is developing more comprehensive archaeological protections for the convict-era underground. Darwin is working to integrate the Larrakia heritage values of the harbour into the planning framework for the waterfront. None of this is enough. The pace of change is slower than the pace of development. The resources available for heritage management are not commensurate with the scale and the significance of what needs to be managed. The legal frameworks are still incomplete in their recognition of Aboriginal heritage values, particularly the non-material values, the dreaming paths, and the spiritual geography that does not reduce to the material record of objects and deposits. But the direction is right. The cities are becoming more aware of what they are built on, more willing to acknowledge that the sealed places beneath them contain histories that belong to the future as well as to the past. It is this awareness that we have been cultivating tonight, moving through the 8 underground histories, letting the weight of the sealed places settle into consciousness, not to feel guilty about what has been covered over, though there are elements of these histories that do warrant something like guilt, but to feel the depth of the ground on which the cities stand, to know that the surface is not all there is. To understand that the 200 years of European settlement that shaped the visible landscape of Australian cities is a thin layer over a record that goes back much further, and that is, in every meaningful sense, still present beneath the bitumen and the concrete and the foundations. The 50,000 years of Aboriginal occupation is still there. The dreaming paths still run through the stone beneath the city streets. The middens are still in the soil beneath the wharves and the warehouses. The oldest continuous human presence anywhere on Earth is sealed beneath 8 cities that were built over it within the last 2 centuries. And it has not gone anywhere. It is patient. It does not require acknowledgement to persist. But it benefits from acknowledgement, and the cities benefit from acknowledging it. And the relationship between the surface and the underground becomes more honest and more workable when the surface knows what is beneath it. This is what the dark has to offer tonight. Not darkness as absence, not darkness as the mere absence of light, but darkness as presence, as the condition that preserves and holds and waits. The tank stream and its sandstone tunnel, the Victorian brickwork carrying the weight of Melbourne above it, the Kaurna dreaming path threading through the Adelaide foundations, the submerged farms of the Molonglo Valley floor, the female factory yard with its history in the soil, the Darwin harbour sediments with their millennia of Larrakia occupation, the Perth limestone with its blind crustaceans and its ancient water, the Hobart dolerite cold and permanent in the winter dark. All of it is there. All of it is sealed. All of it is waiting in the very particular silence of things that have been underground for a very long time. And we have been with it tonight, moving through these underground histories as gently and as patiently as the dark itself. Let the weight of it settle now. Not as a burden, but as ballast, the steadying weight of deep time and deep place. The ground beneath the cities is very deep and very old, and it holds everything that has ever been placed in it. Let that holding be a comfort. Let the patience of the underground be something that the surface of this particular night can borrow for a while. The 8 cities are quiet above their sealed places. The streets above the tank stream are empty now. The streets above the Melbourne sewers carry no traffic. The Kangaroo Point cliffs are dark above the wartime tunnels. The Perth aquifer is moving its slow water through the limestone in the dark. The Kaurna dreaming paths are running through the Adelaide foundations in the deep stillness of the early hours. The Molonglo Valley is at the bottom of Lake Burleigh Griffin, and the water above it is perfectly still. The female factory yard is quiet beneath the pre-dawn Hobart dark. And the Darwin sandstone is the same temperature it is always, cool and constant in the tropical night, holding the oil tunnel walls and the rock art surfaces, and the Larrakia harbour sediments with the same equanimity with which it has always held them. Rest now. Let the underground have the night. Let the sealed places continue their long, quiet work of preservation and waiting. And let the surface, with all its noise and light and urgency, rest for a few hours in the knowledge that it is held. The ground is patient, the dark is deep, and there is nowhere you need to be. The quality of waiting that belongs to sealed places is not the same in every city. In Sydney, the underground waiting has the particular character of a very old settlement, a sense that the layers have had time to press against each other and integrate and become something more unified than the sum of their individual histories. 2 centuries and more of European occupation, laid over 50,000 years of Aboriginal presence, laid over the geological record of the Sandstone Basin, creates an underground that feels dense, that has a quality of compressed weight to it. The tank stream has been flowing through its brick-lined tunnel for so long that it is no longer possible to think of it as separate from the sandstone it flows through. They have become one thing, the made infrastructure and the natural rock, integrated by time into a single material reality beneath the city streets. In Darwin, by contrast, the underground has a quality of recency and exposure that distinguishes it from all the other capitals. The city above it is young, rebuilt from almost nothing after Cyclone Tracy, and the youth of the surface gives the underground a different kind of prominence. When everything above is recent, the things that are not recent stand out with unusual clarity. The wartime oil tunnels are only 75 years old, younger than many living Australians, and yet they feel ancient against the backdrop of a city that is largely less than 50 years old. The Larakia rock art on the sandstone surfaces is thousands of years old, and the contrast between that deep time and the young city above it is more dramatic in Darwin than anywhere else on the continent. This contrast between the deep time of the Aboriginal presence and the shallow time of the European settlement is present in every Australian capital, but it is most stark in Darwin because Darwin has had the least time to smooth it over with accumulated layers of colonial and post-colonial history. The other capitals have had time to build their own layers of heritage, to develop their own underground histories that provide some buffer between the present and the Aboriginal past. Darwin is still close to the surface of the Aboriginal past in a way that the southern cities are not, and this proximity creates a different kind of awareness of what the ground contains. There is a specific quality of attention that the very old underground demands. When you know that the Aboriginal archaeology beneath the cities goes back 50,000 years or more, when you try to hold that span of time in your mind and feel its weight, there is a kind of cognitive vertigo that the knowledge produces. 50,000 years is not a number that human experience is equipped to process directly. It is more than twice as long as the oldest written human history. It is long enough for the physical geography of Australia to have changed substantially, for sea levels to have risen and fallen, for the coastlines to have moved. The people whose archaeology lies beneath these cities were living through climatic and environmental changes that make the changes of recorded history look trivial, and they were doing so successfully, with a knowledge of the land and a management of its resources that allowed continuous occupation of the continent through the last ice age, and the flooding of the coastal lowlands, and the drying of the interior, and all the other changes that 50,000 years contains. The sealed archaeology beneath the 8 Australian capitals is not just the material residue of 50,000 years of human presence. It is the material residue of 50,000 years of successful human adaptation to one of the most challenging environments on Earth, maintained by a set of cultural and intellectual traditions that were sophisticated enough to carry the necessary knowledge through that entire period. The European settlers who arrived in 1788 and built their city on the sandstone ridges above Port Jackson were arriving in a place that had been inhabited and managed by human beings for 50,000 years. They did not know this, or they chose not to know it, which amounts to the same practical result. They built their city on the premise that the land was empty, or nearly empty, that what they were doing was new in a way that justified the comprehensive displacement of the people who were already there. The underground of Sydney, and of every other Australian capital, is the material record of how completely that premise was wrong. What is sealed beneath these cities is the evidence of the wrongness. The middens and the stone tools and the hearths and the dreaming paths and the rock art and the buried wetlands where the ceremonies were performed are all forms of evidence that the land was not empty, that it was known and managed and inhabited in ways that 2 centuries of European settlement have mostly failed to match in terms of sustainability and long-term viability. This is not a comfortable thought, and the cities above the sealed places do not generally organize themselves around it. But the evidence is there, in the dark, patient and complete, waiting for the surface to develop the capacity to receive it. Sleep is its own kind of underground. The brain, in sleep, processes the material of the day in the dark, running its assessments and consolidating its memories, and making its quiet adjustments to the model of the world that waking consciousness uses to navigate. The sealed places beneath the cities do something analogous. They hold the material that has been removed from active circulation, the archaeology and the infrastructure, and the history that the surface has covered over, and they maintain it in the conditions of the underground, stable and dark and preserved, available in principle if the surface ever needs to reach down for it. The cities above them are complex and busy and full of the noise of the present, and they mostly do not look down. But the underground is always there, beneath the noise and the light, holding its long inventory of what has been sealed away. The tank stream and the Victorian sewers, and the Kangaroo Point tunnels and the Perth limestone cavities, and the Kana dreaming paths and the Molonglo Valley farmsteads and the Hobart dolerite and the Darwin sandstone are all part of the same deep record, the record that the continent keeps of everything that has happened on and under its surface. Somewhere in that record, in the sediment of the buried Brisbane wetlands and the soil of the Adelaide parklands, and the compressed alluvium of the Canberra Valley floor, and the anaerobic deposits of the Hobart inner city, and the cave sediments of the ACT limestone country, and the deep fills of the Perth coastal plain, there are stories that have not yet been read, not metaphorical stories. Actual records of actual events, encoded in pollen grains and bone fragments and charcoal particles and artifact concentrations and chemical gradients, waiting for the combination of scientific tools and interpretive frameworks and cultural permission that would allow them to be read. Reading them will not be simple or quick. It will require collaboration between the scientific community and the Aboriginal communities whose heritage is contained in those sediments, a collaboration that is still in its early stages in most of the 8 cities we have considered. It will require the development of non-destructive analytical techniques that can extract information from the sealed deposits without requiring their full excavation. It will require the funding and the institutional will that large-scale archaeological research demands. And it will require the time that the cities have not yet been willing to give the underground. But the stories are there. The time is deep, and the sealed places are not going anywhere. Let the night have this thought for its last occupation. The ground beneath the 8 Australian capitals is very old and very deep and very patient, and it holds within it the evidence of the longest human story in the world, maintained in the dark beneath cities that are still learning to understand what they are built on. The surface is young and noisy and full of the urgency of the present. The underground is ancient and quiet and full of the patience of things that have been waiting for a very long time. Rest. The ground beneath you is deep, the dark around the sealed places is complete, and the 50,000 years is there, in the soil and the stone and the sediment, holding everything that has been placed in it, waiting in the very particular silence that belongs to underground spaces and to the deep hours of the night, when the surface quiets enough to allow the underground to be felt.